Why has it been so hard to make a semi-decent Dungeons & Dragons movie? I finally got to see D&D Honor Among Thieves, and huzzah! I am so happy to tell you it was a solid, fun, entertaining film. I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in the realm of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And go ahead and call me Miss Daisy if you're nasty. Unless you've been living under a rock, you probably know that Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop role-playing game from the 70s, started by Gary Gygax, which I started playing religiously in college in the 80s. Now, back in the day, it was always relegated to that thing those weirdos did, but it was getting to be known to the general public, though not always in the most positive light. Even back then, there was a wave of movies that arguably were inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, but nothing really successful except maybe the Conan movies. There was a Dungeons & Dragons cartoon series in the 80s, which lasted 3 seasons but was canceled before they could even finish the conclusion to the series. But I will say that there were some pretty decent books published by Dungeons & Dragons, or TSR, around that time, thanks mainly to Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, who wrote the really fun Dragonlance novels. As the reputation of Dungeons & Dragons got a little bit better, an attempt was made at a major studio for a Dungeons & Dragons movie in 2000 called Dungeons & Dragons. It was a big budget affair and had Jeremy Irons as the villain, and there was a lot of buzz, at least in the D&D community, but the movie was bad. Really bad. I think the major reason was that nobody thought to actually take fantasy seriously. So they decided to insert lots of slapstick and adolescent humor.
You gotta get yourself a nice 250-pound dwarf, huh? Well, hair on her chin you can hang on to.
Now, I like a little comedy relief in my movies, but there's a line to cross that completely undermines the story. Also, I don't know where they spent the $45 million budget, but it certainly wasn't with special effects. Needless to say, it was a huge box office flop. But Jeremy Irons was hilarious as the over-the-top wizard who basically eats up all the scenery whenever he's on screen.
Destiny! Come to me!
At that time, it felt like no movie could ever do justice to the fantasy genre, but then in came Lord of the Rings, which put the kibosh on that idea. So another D&D movie was attempted in 2005, but with a much lower budget, and it was called The Wrath of the Dragon God, which went direct to video, and it wasn't great. It went in the other direction of the first movie and tried to be really serious with no comedy relief, and it was a pretty dry and boring story. Since then, movies inspired by role-playing games were in the domain of either parodies like Your Highness, or super low-budget, almost fan-made movies like Mythica, which you probably never heard of, except if you're a Critical Role fan, then you know that Matt Mercer starred as the villain. And there was 5 films in the series, and they did get Kevin Sorbo, the actor who played Hercules in Hercules, as the big name, though he was a bit long in the tooth at the time. I tried to watch the movies and wasn't able to finish them. It's another dry storyline, bad special effects, and meh. So this brings us to Honor Among Thieves, which was a Hasbro movie. Yes, Hasbro, the toy company, who put a lot on the line for an epic scale D&D movie, which I assume they hope to cross-pollinate with the D&D game, which they owned. But they didn't get the D&D fan bump they were hoping for because just prior to the movie's release, the D&D brand was tarnished by Hasbro through their franchise Wizards of the Coast. Now, I talked about this in my Critical Role videos, but the TLDR is that D&D was always under some type of open gaming license, which Hasbro tried to renege on. And after facing a huge negative backlash from the D&D community, which included boycotting this movie, they backed down. And there are tons of YouTube videos. If you want to know more, just search for it. But even though Hasbro reversed their decision, I think it left a bad taste for a lot of D&D fans. So there wasn't much celebration from the community that I think would have been there if this fracas never occurred. Anyway, I'm just here to review the movie. It opens with a prison scene that, in my opinion, goes on way too long, like almost 15 minutes. It's basically our main character, Edgin, played by Chris Pine, and his barbarian friend, a woman named Holga, played by Michelle Rodriguez, who are both in prison for thievery. And they're pleading before a panel of judges or prison wardens or something why they should be released early. I guess this was a writer's way of cleverly inserting the backstory of the characters, because there's a lot of flashbacks, but it was framed in a comic way, as Edgin kept asking where one of the judges were.
Again, I noticed that Chancellor Jonathan is not present. Should we perhaps wait?
Chancellor Jonathan was delayed by the storm. You may begin.
I see. It's just that we were really counting on him to attend. I'm sorry, it's just hard to relive this without Jonathan here.
Again with this?
But he missed the most important part of my backstory. How can he judge me without knowing my motivation? Before you announce your decision, I implore you to please wait for...
And this sets up the tone for the movie, that there's going to be lots of cheekiness and fun and humor. But I'm happy to report that it did not cross the line into crass adolescent humor that ruined the first Dungeons & Dragons movie. I'm also a Chris Pine fan. Ever since I thought he was perfectly cast as Captain Kirk on the Star Trek movie reboot, I've loved him. And Michelle Rodriguez was a great choice to play the barbarian Holga because she was always so deadpan and dry and had these great facial moments. And there was, thankfully, no romantic subplot between them, which would have made the movie go in a unfortunate direction, but that didn't happen. Still, it was obvious the movie wanted to be part comedy throughout. Unlike, say, just having comedy relief elements like Merry and Pippin in Lord of the Rings, they wanted to be a comedy. But I think it worked here for the movie they wanted to create. Like I said, I think this opening scene went on too long, though we do find out that Edgin is a harper, which I think is a bard. At least he carries a lute, but he has no magic powers like every other D&D bard. So I guess they were leaning on his spying and thieving skills, though that's never really developed in the movie. Basically, he says he's the planner.
What is it exactly that you bring to this?
Me? I'm a planner. You know, I make plans.
You've already made the plan, so what value do you have now?
If the plan fails, the existing plan, I make a new plan.
So you make plans that fail.
No.
He also plays the lute.
Holga, not relevant. Trust me, I'm indispensable.
We find out he and Holga were part of an adventuring party that were trying to pull off a heist that included an amulet to bring back Edgin's dead wife, so their daughter would no longer be motherless. His wife was then stabbed by a red wizard, which means they couldn't be healed by a cleric. So, anyway, Edgin and Holga get out of prison, first to find the daughter, who is now being raised by one of their old party members, Forge Fitzwilliams, played by Hugh Grant. I'm not quite sure what his role was in the old adventuring parties, except they called him a con man, so I guess a thief. Oh yeah, I kept trying to figure out what everyone's D&D class was. Hugh Grant, no surprise, was another great casting choice. He played the charming yet greedy con man who somehow becomes Lord of Neverwinter and foster father to Edgin's daughter, Kira. But he betrays Edgin and Holga and wants to keep the daughter for himself. So guess what? Edgin and Holga have to form another party to rescue Kira. They first recruit Simon the Sorcerer, played by Justice Smith, who they worked with before, and they recruit Doric the Druid, played by Sophia Lillis. We find out there's also a dark plot by the Red Wizards. And I have to give a shout out to a paladin we meet later, Zank Yendar, played by Reggie Jean Page, who you may have seen in Bridgerton. He was fantastic as the too perfect, too handsome paladin who didn't understand irony or sarcasm. The plot was probably the weakest part of the film for me, because I thought it was a bit predictable. First, we form a party to do the quest, but in order to do the quest, we have to go on a side quest to get the thing we need to do the main quest. And during the main quest, something goes wrong and we have to escape a puzzle. Basically, the plot is actually super similar to the first D&D movie, but it works here. It works because the writing didn't cross that line into satire.
Hair on her chin you can hang on to!
And the actors gave really great performances. If you are a D&D fan, you'll love seeing lots of D&D creatures, like owlbears, intellect developers. I think I saw some rust monsters, gelatinous cubes, displacer beast, which I was always fascinated with as a player, so I kind of wish that we also saw blink dogs. And of course, there was a dragon. And they managed to create a dragon that was unusual physically. So it's always nice when your expectations are subverted. I also thought some of the scenes and characters were poking good-humored fun at D&D gaming, like the paladin who is so good he annoys you, traps and mazes created by DMs that are so over the top it leaves you going, what the f? The Speak with Dead spell was hilarious. Oh, if you are a Critical Role fan, one of the lines had to be a reference to the Bell's Health campaign.
How about this one? You people like the smell of fresh cut grass? Open up the bag. Smell that? It's fresh cut grass.
By the way, I'm doing a video series on the Bell's Health campaign. If you're interested, if you follow Critical Role, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Oh, and if you like this video and want to see more movie reviews, give this video a thumbs up. I think the movie was a little on the long side. I don't think the opening needed to be quite as long as it was, and some of the little side scenes really didn't need to be there, like meeting Holga's ex-husband was totally unnecessary. And I also didn't find it funny, even though I'm assuming they put it in just because they thought it would get a laugh. But overall, I give Honor Among Thieves my blessing. I think D&D fans will have a lot of fun seeing this movie. Yet, I think it is totally accessible to a general audience. I guess I'd call it a comedy fantasy because there is so much humor, but the humor didn't go low or too far, at least not for me. Until we meet again, may all the books you read, the movies you see, and the campaigns you play be blessed.